Lovely to be sharing the first of these Lent talks with you as we reflect on the untold stories that have guided the faith of some of us who work here at the cathedral and who guide the ministry here. Untold Stories is the theme not just for our Lent talks, but the theme which we're exploring in lots of different ways through 2023 here at Carlisle Cathedral. The untold story I wish to tell today is about a poem which has meant a great deal for me through most of my life. It's a poem by the English 17th century writer and composer Thomas Campion, and it's called View Me, Lord, a Work of Thine. I first remember it at the age of 12 when I sang for 2 weeks at Canterbury Cathedral and sang a setting of it, a setting that we'll hear in a few moments' time. And the words somehow stayed with me and got lodged deep in the back of my brain, because when many years later I was preparing for ordination and on silent retreats, I kept on coming back to those words. And so without the ministrations of a smartphone or book of poetry, I tried my best to remember the words and wrote them down to be part of my prayer life through those days of preparation. And so when I came to the cathedral here almost 2 years ago and was asked what piece of music I might like sung at my installation service, I suggested that perhaps the choir might be able to sing Richard Lloyd's setting of this poem, View Me, Lord, a Work of Thine, and was delighted to discover that the girls' choir had it in their repertoire and therefore were able to sing it for me that day. It's perhaps a strange coincidence that the day that I'm recording this talk, the girls' choir also sang it beautifully for us at evensong tonight. So who was Thomas Campion? Well, Campion was born in 1567, quite perhaps appropriately for the subject of a Lent talk, born on Ash Wednesday in 1657 in London. He received a very fine education, first at Peterhouse in Cambridge and then at Gray's Inn in London, but did not gain any formal qualification for either of those two settings, only finally settling into the role as a doctor, a medic, training at the University of Caen in Normandy in 1605. But Campion's main love and main reputation came as a writer of poems and a composer of lute songs. He was, in that way, part of a group of writers and poets led by Ben Jonson, who bridged between the world of Shakespeare at the end of the 16th century and that great flowering of English poetry in John Milton, John Donne, and George Herbert in the early to mid-decades of the 17th century. In that rich tradition of English poetry, we might say that Campion is a poet of the second rank, but no less worthy, I think, of our attention for it. What continues to draw people to Campion's poetry, what draws me to it, is the directness and simplicity of that poetry. They were written first and foremost as songs, and so they have a simplicity. They can't afford complex allusions or dense meaning in the context of the songs with which they were written. Rather, they are simple and elegant, and very often quite short poems that draw the listener in and beguile them in that simplicity. Like many poets of this era, perhaps the best example being John Donne, there is always a balance between the sacred and profane in Campion's poetry. In his preface to his second book of Airs, from which View Me, Lord is written, he describes that balance in this way. Out of many songs which, partly at the request of friends, partly for my own recreation, were by me long since composed, I have now enfranchised a few, sending them forth, divided according to their different subjects into several books. The first are grave and pious, the second amorous and light. However, like a great poet, he's able to hold two ideas in his head at once, and so we very often find the language and the sensuality of the amorous and light drawn into his reflections on the pious and the holy. Perhaps Campion's most well-known poem is one, Never Weather-Beaten Sail, famously set to music by Parry in his Songs of Farewell. And in that poem, we get that image, that balance between the amorous and light in the language through which Campion describes his engagement and understanding of God and the Spirit. Never weather-beaten sail more willingly bent to shore, never tired pilgrim's limbs affected slumber more, than my wearied sprite now longs to fly out of my troubled breast, O come quickly, sweetest Lord, and take my soul to rest. So we come now to the poem in question. This wonderful poem begins with a very simple request. View me, Lord, a work of thine. In this simple request, though, are two deep spiritual truths that it's worth us reflecting on at the beginning of this discussion and exploration. The first is that we are the work of God, and as the work of God, we can expect that God will seek to look at us and view us and see us in our most true selves, perhaps to see us, to quote another famous 17th century Englishman, warts and all. But at the heart of Campion's request is not perhaps some bluff roundhead arrogance or a vain cavalier desire to be wanted and loved. As the verse continues, Campion asks us not that God sees what is wrong in us, but that we might shine, we might be made full of light, as signs of God's grace in our lives and in the world. The next verse begins again with a request, cleanse me, Lord, that I may kneel at thine altar, pure and white. This verse, I think, places this poem very much in its religious time and context. Written in about 1613, or certainly published in 1613, it sits in that period of time that church historians would not like me describing as a phony war in English theological life and debate. Certainly it sits between the settlement of English religious life with the Elizabethan settlement of the mid-16th century and the total fracturing and falling apart of that settlement in the wars and violence of the English Civil War in the middle decades of the 17th century. And so in that way, it sits in a place where it was possible for writers and thinkers and theologians to draw on a breadth of allusions and language without fear for being misunderstood in how they did that. And so here we have an allusion, some language, that at first sight might draw us to a more Catholic sense of spirituality and piety, of an altar pure and white. But this is the writing of somebody firmly in the world of the Reformation, something that you would expect from a person who, it is said, fought with English adventurers in the European wars of religion in the 1590s. So in this image, we see something of this debate and the breadth of this debate played out. The altar, pure and white, is not a place of our work and our action. Rather, the altar is God's. It is the place where we ask that we might kneel. But by doing so, we realize that there is nothing that we can do to gain the benefits of that altar. Rather, it is only from God's gaze, from God's grace, that we are drawn into the delights that we might find from that, and that for the mercy of God revealed in that love and that grace. If the second verse places this poem in its religious and theological and historical context, the third verse places it firmly in the great breadth and sweep of God's economy, God's story for all of humanity. In it, we find first a desire to be drawn away from the particularities of our place and our time. Worldly joys like shadows fade when the heavenly light appears. But the basis of that hope and that experience is the great story of God's love for humanity, that great story told through the covenants of the Old Testament, of Adam and Noah, of Abraham and Isaac and David and Solomon. A covenant which was then confirmed and renewed and revived in the new covenant of Jesus Christ. And so the hope that we might find in the heavenly life where the shadows fade is revealed to us or echoed in the experience of this world around us. It is an image that always draws me and reminds me of those words from Psalm 84, where we are told by the psalmist that one day in thy courts are better than 1,000 in the lands and tents of the world around us. So this wonderful and simple poem draws us into the time and theology within which it was written, but also into the great scope and scale of God's love revealed in salvation history. But for me, the heart of this poem comes in this great and beautiful prayer, which makes up the final verse. In this, we find a great simplicity and a great trust in who we are in God's love. As I said at the beginning of this short talk, I was drawn back to this poem on my ordination retreat, and it may have been that I was drawn to this poem because at the same time I was reflecting on the words of the ordination that would be prayed for me by the bishop when I was ordained and made deacon. In that ordination service, in all the ordination services, the bishop prays, "You cannot bear the weight of this calling by your own strength, but only by the grace and power of God. Pray therefore that your heart may be daily enlarged and your understanding of the scriptures enlightened. Pray earnestly for the gift of the Holy Spirit." As we begin our Lenten journey, I wonder whether this is a prayer and a sentiment that we might hold to ourselves, a reflection that the journey that we will take through this Lent is not one that we ever take alone. Jesus, even when he travelled into the wilderness, was accompanied by the angels who served him at the end of that Lenten journey. And as we travel through this Lent and towards the foot of the cross, we need to know that we travel with one another, but also that we travel with God's grace, that God is with us in the Spirit and through Jesus as we walk our way to the foot of the cross. And this final verse, this short prayer poem at the end, has two particular Lenten images that remind us of that truth. In the penultimate verse, we are given two pictures of who we are as we are filled with God's grace. The first is that we are clay, a word and an image that draws me immediately to Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he reminds us that we carry the grace of God in clay jars, in fragile, brittle jars, but no less precious treasure for the vessel that carries them. And secondly, that we are dust, that great picture, that great image, that great reality of our Lenten journey. In the words that we are told on Ash Wednesday, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But it is in those clay jars, in that dust from the earth, that God breathes his Spirit, brings us to life, and through that grace lifts each one of us high. So as we come to the end of this short reflection on this untold story, we might just reflect on all those words again as they are set by Richard Lloyd in that beautiful short anthem which I spoke of at the beginning of this talk. And as we do so, you might like to reflect on three questions that I put on the screen in front of us. The first is, what would God see in me if I had the courage to ask God to view me? The second is, what grace and mercy of God do we feel in our lives? And the third and final question, how might we put our trust in God this Lent?